This overview covers Hebrew verbs and syntax. To begin with a definition of a verb, it's helpful to begin by looking at types of verbs. There are essentially two types of verbs. So a verb describes either an action or a state of being. We have two example sentences here of action verbs. George threw the ball, or Mary hiked the mountain. In those sentences, you can see how the verbs there convey some type of action that's taking place. The second type of thing that a verb can describe is a state of being. A state of being is conveyed by a being verb, such as is or are or was or were. John is tall. People are kind. In those two sentences, you can see that the verb is and are conveys a state of being for John and the people. In many ways, a state of being verb conveys a type of adjective, a descriptive of the subject. So these are the two essential definitions of a verb that we find in English, and it's the same with Hebrew. When we talk about Hebrew verbs, we eventually talk about parsing the verb. Parsing a verb means to pick it apart and to identify all of its component parts. In English, we also have parsing, essentially, but we talk about that in terms of conjugating verbs. When we conjugate verbs, we talk about the subject. Is it a first person, a second person, or a third person subject, or what its tense is? Is it past tense, present tense, future tense? We talk about those same types of things in Hebrew verbs, but we call it parsing a verb as opposed to conjugating a verb. In Hebrew, there are 5 principal parts involved with every Hebrew verb. You'll want to be sure to be able to commit these 5 terms to memory to denote that these essential elements are associated with every Hebrew verb. And these 5 parts are: 1, each verb conveys tense; 2, each verb conveys a stem; and each verb conveys a person, gender, and a number. We'll talk about each of these, but again, you'll want to be able to distinguish each of these 5 components, and you'll want to commit to memory that these 5 elements or parts are associated with every Hebrew verb. And when we talk about parsing, we'll always be talking about these 5 elements. We'll begin by taking each of those 5 elements in turn and discussing it a little fuller so that you understand what we mean by each of those elements: tense, stem, person, gender, and number. To begin with, we'll talk about the verb stems. That's one of our 5 parts of a verb. Every verb conveys what is called a stem. Now, a stem is actually a type of action that we could talk about. Every Hebrew verb has some type of action, and in fact there are 7 categories of action or types of verbs we could talk about in Hebrew, and that's called a stem, essentially. There's another word for these in some Hebrew courses. We're not concerned with this term, but it helps you understand what we mean by stems. In Hebrew, these stems are actually called binyanim. What that means is binyanim it's the Hebrew word for buildings. And so these 7 stems are essentially ways that Hebrew words are built or put together. And again, these 7 stems all convey something specific about a verb. It essentially gives it a special nuanced type of action that is being conveyed by the verb. Now, if you'll see this chart here, this chart helps us to identify and categorize the 7 stems to make it a little bit easier to wrap our brain around it. So, in a normal Hebrew course, we would take several weeks to go through each of these stems one by one to see how they play out in a verb's spelling. Each of these stems does affect the way a verb is spelled. Each of these stems essentially reflects a pattern of spelling on a verb, essentially. That's beyond the scope of our course to learn what each of the patterns look like, but we do want to do some definitions with these 7 stems. We essentially want to treat this sort of as a vocabulary exercise to learn what each of the stems means when we see a verb in that stem. The reason for this is that when you go and do a Hebrew word study, you'll often see a verb categorized according to its, you'll see it categorized as either a cal verb or a pl verb. or a puel verb. It's helpful for you to have some point of reference to know what a lexicon or a Hebrew dictionary means when it says a verb is a cal verb or a puel verb, for example. So what we're going to do essentially is we're just going to define those terms in our course. To do that, we'll be using this chart, and you'll see this chart again on your final exam, so you will want to essentially learn how to populate a chart just like this. So if you see a chart like this on your final exam, your goal is to see if you can plug in each of the stem names in the appropriate box. And you don't have to know all of the wording in the box essentially. But if you're given a chart like this, you know, what verb is active voice and simple action in the left-hand upper box, that's a cal verb. So be prepared to populate a chart just like this one. But let's go over this chart so you'll understand exactly what it's conveying about these stems. There are 7 stems in Hebrew: cal, piel, hifil, nifal, pual, hofal. You'll see that nifal is recorded twice on this chart, and our 7th stem is hitpael. Now, each of these stems is categorized according to the voice that it communicates and the type of action that it communicates. Now, voice, essentially, all that really means is that we're talking mostly about active voice and passive voice. Now, we do add a third type of voice in Hebrew, and that's called reflexive voice. In Hebrew, rather in English, we also are used to active and passive voice. And the same connotation associated with active and passive voice holds true for Hebrew active and passive voice as well. So what do I mean by active voice? What I mean by active voice is that the subject is performing an action. I could say, he threw a ball. In that sentence, our subject, he, is actively throwing a ball. So the subject is performing an action. Now, when I talk about passive voice, the converse is true. Instead of the subject performing an action, an action is being performed on the subject. So instead of he threw the ball, for example, we could say he was thrown. In that sentence, our subject, he, is not performing any type of action. In fact, an action is being performed on our subject, he. He is being thrown, which suggests he's not in control of the action that's happening there. So that's all we mean by active voice and passive voice. Now, when we talk about reflexive voice, in reflexive voice, the way we generally associate that in Hebrew is that the subject of a verb is performing an action upon or for itself. So in an example phrase or sentence to understand what reflexive voice looks like, we could say, he threw himself. In that phrase, you can clearly see how the subject, he, is performing an action. He's throwing something, but he's throwing himself, i.e. he threw himself down. We could say that in a sentence. So that sentence essentially conveys what we mean by reflexive voice. There's an action that the subject is performing upon itself. So we have those 3 types of voice in Hebrew: active, passive, and reflexive. There are also 3 types of action we have in Hebrew verb stems, essentially: simple action, intensive action, and causative action. When I say simple action, all I mean there is that it's the most basic type of action you could see in a verb. He threw, it's just a basic type of action. He walked, he talked, he spoke. All of those are simple action verbs. They are conveying a basic type of action, nothing special. Intensive action conveys just that. It essentially intensifies the action that we see in the simple action. So instead of saying he threw a ball, I could say he hurled a ball. In that sentence, you can see how perhaps some more force is going into that particular verb. He hurled a ball hard. So in that sentence, you can sort of hear how there's more action, more forceful action taking place in the intensive action. Thirdly, we have what's called causative action. Causative action simply means that there's a causative force that's making the action happen or that's being acted upon. So a basic sort of entry into seeing causative action work is this basic sentence: he caused someone to throw a ball. So I could say the umpire made the pitcher throw a ball. In that sentence, the umpire is causing the pitcher to throw. So essentially, there's sort of another force that's causing something to happen, that's causing the subject to perform an action, essentially, in the causative action. So these are just some basic sentences to help get us into looking at each of these stems. Now, if you'll note that the way these stems are each situated, they're situated in a specific place or block on this chart. And the position essentially tells you two things. It tells you what the type of voice is for that stem and what the type of action is for that stem. So for example, a cal stem, a cal verb, tells us two things. One, it tells us that that verb is conveying active voice and it's conveying simple action. So it's conveying two things, simple action, active voice. So note in each of these blocks, essentially we have the stem, a sample phrase so you can get an idea of what that stem is conveying, and then the two characteristics of that stem, the action and the voice that it conveys. So cal is essentially the most basic type of verb we have in Hebrew. Most verbs in Hebrew are cal, meaning they're simple action, active voice verbs. Nothing, overly special about that. It's just a typical way that verbs occur in Hebrew. We can move down that column and look at the nifal verbs below it. Nifal, of course, is categorized twice here. So essentially what that means is that nifal verbs can be categorized as a passive voice with a simple action verb, or some nifal verbs are also reflexive voice and simple action as well. So when I say simple action passive voice, it's essentially just like it's a cal verb, it's just turned passive. So he threw becomes he was thrown. Again, it's just turning the cal verb passive in the nifal stem. Now, every once in a while, in a very rare occasion, nifal verbs, it's not passive voice, it's actually reflexive voice. Still simple action, but reflexive voice. So the reflexive sentence could be he threw himself. In that sentence, you can see the reflexive action happening. Our subject is he. He's throwing himself. He's performing an action upon himself. Now, it's still a simple action. It's still, basic action that's happening there. So these are our two simple action stems, cal and nifal, and cal is simple action, active voice. Nifal is simple action, passive voice, or every once in a while it can be simple action and reflexive voice. In our second column, we have the intensive action stems. So PL essentially conveys two things. It conveys both intensive action and it's still active voice. Note it's in the active voice row, so that tells us it's still active voice, but the action is a little bit different. It's sometimes more intensified with PL. So with the intensive action and active voice, essentially what we would have is instead of he threw, a simple action, we have he hurled. So the PL stem, a point of reference is to think of it as that it intensifies the stem, it intensifies the action that we got in the cal stem. In the block below PL, we have a stem that sounds almost like it, but it's pu'al. Pu'al is very similar to PL. It's also intensive action, but it's passive voice. So essentially where we have the active voice in PL, he hurled, that becomes passive in pu'al. So an example phrase or sentence there would be he was hurled. In that sentence, of course, our subject, he, is not performing the action, but action is being performed upon the subject there. So pu'al is our second intensive stem, intensive action stem. And thirdly, our third intensive action stem is hithpael. So hithpael is intensive action, but the voice is different. It's also reflexive voice, just like nifal was. So hithpael, we can think of that as sort of intensifying the voice that we saw in the nifal reflexive voice. Instead of he threw himself, we could see he hurled himself. You can see the intensive action portrayed in that phrase there. So far we've gone through the first five, cal, nifal, PL, pu'al, and hithpael. Cal and nifal are our simple action stems. PL, pu'al, and hithpael are our intensive action stems. And again, depending on what row they're on, we can see how these stems have they convey different voice. Cal and PL are both active voice. Nifal and Pual are both passive voice. And Nifal can also be reflexive, just like Hithpael is reflexive voice. Our third column has only two stems in it, Hifil and Hofal. Those are our causative action stems. So they're a little bit different. They actually have this sort of caused to do something, caused sort of extra word in our sentence there to demonstrate the aspect of causative action. So Hifil is our causative action stem and its active voice. So he caused someone to throw or he made someone to throw. Again, in this sentence, there's sort of an extra step of action. Someone else is causing something to happen. We could say, here's another sentence that is a little closer to the Old Testament that you can sort of hear this happening. That sometimes we get this verb operating this way. The verb to rule or become king. Whenever that verb is in the causative action stem in Hifil, it sounds something like this. The Lord made David king. The Lord caused David to rule. You can hear that. You can hear sort of there's this force of action that's behind the subject, essentially. So the Lord made David king, or the Lord caused David to be king. In that sentence, you can definitely see how there's a force that's causing someone else to do something, essentially. Now, Hofal just takes that essential action and it turns it passive from the Hifil. So instead of he caused to throw or he made someone to throw, Hifil would say he was caused to throw or he was made to throw. In that sentence, I could say David was made to be king. It just turns the active it turns, the voice passive. David was made king by the Lord. That essentially just turns the verb in a passive sense. There's still a causative there. David was caused to be king or was caused to rule by the Lord. It shows that the Lord is still sort of the force there behind his becoming king, but it just is turning the action passive. So these are our 7 stems. Primarily, you're learning these as vocabulary words, essentially. What the goal of this is to learn these basics. That cal stem conveys 2 things: simple action and active voice. That puel, for example, is intensive action and passive voice, or that, for example, hithpael is intensive action, reflexive voice. So you just want to learn the associations of each stem. Now, I do sort of want to give some kind of caution at this point in the course so that you'll be mildly aware of it as you move beyond learning an introduction to biblical languages. Our course is very much just an introduction, which means we learn a bit of grammar so that you can navigate books like lexicons and dictionaries and understand things like basics, what a book means when it says a verb is in the pual stem. Now you have some kind of connotation that pual verbs are passive and they can be intensive action. It's helpful to know that not every verb fits into these neat categories. For example, we have some PL verbs that essentially they're still active voice, but they might not convey an intensive action. Some PL verbs, they simply really convey a simple action like cal does. And some hithpael verbs, some of them don't all reflect an actual reflexive voice where the subject is performing an action upon itself. Some of them reflect more of like repetitive type of actions happening, like he walked to and fro. That type of phrase kind of demonstrates what some hithpael verbs convey. So my point is that this chart is a very neat, cut and dried chart to give you a point of reference right now because you just need something that's clean cut and simple to start with in Hebrew. This is where Hebrew students would also start if they were learning the whole system of Hebrew. They would start with a chart like this to have a point of reference, a home base, to understand what the 7 stems mean. But my caution at this point is just so that you'll be aware that as you move beyond our introductory study, that you're just mildly aware that each of these stems can mean more things than we're able to talk about in this course. So if you ever have questions, you can use a Hebrew grammar book and look up what does the PL stem mean, and that grammar book will tell you all the types of things that a PL stem would mean. So you at least have a place to go to find more information, and that's always going to be in a Hebrew grammar book. But our courses, at least we're beginning with just this simple chart for you to learn these 7 stems and for you to get these basic definitions down for each of these stems. Again, you'll see this chart again in this exact format. I will populate the blocks: active voice, passive voice, reflexive voice, and the top column or row there, simple action, intensive action, and causative action. I'll depend on you to plug the stems in their appropriate place so that you can sort of demonstrate to me that you know at least the basic point of reference for each stem. I may also ask you questions like what stem reflects intensive action and active voice, and your answer would be PL stem does that. All right, so this is essentially what we are learning from the 7 verb stems. All right, so to go back to our home base, parsing. Hebrew verbs convey 5 principal parts: tense, stem, person, gender, and number. We now know that stem, there are 7 stems, and that each stem conveys essentially 2 things: it's the type of voice and the type of action of a verb. Next, we'll talk about the conjugations. Essentially what we mean by that are the tense. So next we'll be talking about tense, and we'll also be using conjugation interchangeably with tense in this next little overview. In English, we also talk about verb conjugations, and in saying that, English verbs essentially convey tense. There are 3 basic types of tense that we talk about in Hebrew: present tense, past tense, and future tense. There are shades of different types of tense in addition to those 3 tenses that we could also learn, like past perfect, etc., that essentially are based on these 3 tenses. But these 3 at least give you a point of reference to move into talking about Hebrew conjugations or tenses. Present tense, essentially all that means is that a verb is, the action is in the present time. I study, you study, we study. There's a present action that's going on there. Or we could talk about past tense. In past tense verb, all that means is that the action happened in the past. I studied, you studied, we studied. In all of those examples, the action of studying happened already in the past. And our third basic tense in English is future tense. We could, some sample phrases: I will study, you will study, and we will study. And all of those sample phrases, the action has not yet happened. It will happen at some point in the future. So in English, these are our 3 basic tenses. In Hebrew, we have some additional types of tenses, or we could also call them conjugations, to talk about. There are 5 conjugations or tenses that you will be aware of in this class. And again, you want to treat learning these tenses like an exercise in vocabulary. There are 5 tenses: perfect, imperfect, imperative, infinitive construct, and participle. Your job is to learn the definition for each of those. Now, each of these conjugations or tenses conveys some type of action or a special function in a sentence. Perfect verbs express completed action. Now, this is sort of an odd way to talk about action with Hebrew verbs, but this is the best way we can approach it in Hebrew. Since Hebrew does not use tense in the exact precise way that English does, the best way that we can talk about tense in Hebrew is to talk about an action that is completed, has been completed, i.e. in the past. And that's what we get with the perfect tense or the perfect conjugation. And an example of how we would think of translating perfect verbs is that their equivalent in English is generally that perfect verbs convey past tense. So I could say he spoke. And in Hebrew, that verb essentially is sort of conveying a perfect tense. It's an action that's completed in the past, conveyed in the past tense in English. So your job is to associate the perfect conjugation or the perfect tense in Hebrew with this definition, that it expresses completed action. Secondly, we have the imperfect conjugation or tense in Hebrew. The imperfect conjugation is the exact opposite of the perfect conjugation. It expresses what we call incomplete action. What that means exactly is that it's an action that has yet to come to an end or to begin. We often then will translate imperfect verbs or the imperfect tense in our English future tense. So I could say he will speak. The action has not come to an end, and so we think of it as a future action. He will speak. It's something that will happen in the future. So again, your essential definition to learn for imperfect verbs is to define it as a verb that expresses incomplete action, and to associate it with the English future tense. Thirdly, we have the imperative conjugation in Hebrew. Imperative verbs express a direct command just like English imperatives. So when you learn the imperative as sort of a vocab term, you want to associate it with a direct command. It works just like our English imperatives. An example of translating it is just like an English imperative. You speak, you clean your room, you study. The implied subject for all imperatives is you. It's either a singular you or a plural you. And it's a command, so it's rendered with an exclamation point. Now that's the same as English imperatives. Fourthly, we have a conjugation that's called infinitive construct. Infinitive construct are very much like our English infinitive. So your definition for the infinitive construct is that it functions as a verbal noun. What I mean by that is that essentially it's a verb, but it really functions like a noun. So an example of an infinitive is the phrase to speak. English infinitives essentially go in that same essential pattern. To speak, to walk, to talk, to write, to read. All of those are infinitives. They're verbs with this preposition to before them. And that's an infinitive together. It's essentially an infinitive phrase, but it's essentially a verb with that word to before it. So that's an infinitive. That's essentially how we render infinitives in many cases in Hebrew as well. But it functions as a verbal noun because it's not actually a verb in a sentence. It's not conveying an actual action in the sentence. It's more functioning like a noun. So I could say, to speak is one of my favorite activities. In that sentence, to speak is actually the subject of a sentence. It's not, there is no action associated with it other than it's sort of, there is an idea that it's actually functioning as a noun in that sentence, even though it's a verb. So for that reason, the definition is that it functions as a verbal noun. And if you're a little hazy on some of these, sort of definitions and what they actually do, that's okay. Just treat this as an exercise in vocabulary to at least get the basics down of what the Hebrew tense mean. Our fifth Hebrew tense or conjugation is called that of participle. Participles in Hebrew function very much like English participles do. I might say that participles often have an ing ending, speaking, talking, walking. They convey a type of continuous action. So the definition for the participle is that it functions as a verbal adjective which can behave like a verb, expressing continuous action, or an adjective which describes a noun. Now that definition reflects exactly what we have with English adjectives. Again, with English participles. Again, participles are usually translated into English with an ing ending because that's how we often translate English or how we render English participles. You can see that working in this sentence here. He was speaking. Note that was speaking is a participle. It's a verb that conveys a continuous action. You can see it with the ing ending. But participles can also be an adjective that describes a noun. So I could say the speaking man. In this sentence, speaking, it's actually an adjective that describes man. I could say the speaking man walked into the grocery store. Now in that sentence, the verb is actually walked. That's the action that's going on there. But I could say the speaking man walked into the grocery store, and in that sentence, the word speaking, it's actually just an adjective. It's just describing man. All right, so participles can function as a verbal adjective, which can behave like a verb or an adjective, essentially. So that's your basic definition for participles to learn. So these are our 5 conjugations or tenses: perfect, imperfect, imperative, infinitive construct, and participle. You will want to learn these definitions associated with each of them in the type of action or function column there. You also want to associate these sort of translation examples with each of them as well. So begin to associate perfect verbs with past tense, imperfect with future tense, imperatives, just like regular English imperatives, they're a command, that infinitives function just like English infinitives for the most part to speak, and that participles are rendered with an ing ending that denote that ongoing action. So these are our 5 tenses or conjugations. We could call them either one. All right, so to go back to our starting point, again, Hebrew verbs, when we talk about parsing them or picking them apart into all of their different aspects, we've talked about tense now. Tense can also stand in for the word conjugation. We talked about the 5 conjugations and tenses. Stem, we talked about the 7 stems: cal, pl, pual. And the next 3 parts, principal parts that every Hebrew verb conveys, are called person, gender, and number. So we'll talk about those next 3 all together. So the person, gender, and number essentially refer to the subject of the verb that's matched with it. Person essentially refers to what our subject is. Is it first person, second person, or third person? First person subjects are I or we. For example, I talked or we talked. The second person subject takes the word you talked. Third person subject would be he, she, or it, or they talked. Those are third person subjects. They're essentially indefinite. So those are the 3 examples of what person refers to. So we have person, gender, and number. Gender refers to the subject of the verb, whether it's masculine, feminine, or common. Now in Hebrew, we've already talked about how every noun is either masculine or feminine. And so Hebrew verbs are essentially spelled a certain way to cause them to match up with their subject noun, whether it's masculine or feminine. Hebrew verbs may also reflect a subject that could either be masculine or feminine, such as the people spoke to Moses in that sentence. That would essentially convey what we'd call a common verb, which means that our subject sort of is a mixed audience, both male and female. The people spoke to Moses. Thirdly, every verb reflects what we call number. What it means is that the verb is matched with either a singular subject or a plural subject. So our verbs can actually be associated with singular. A verb can be singular or plural, depending on its subject. So for example, in the sentence, he throws, our subject, there's only one of them, he, and our verb has to match it. We wouldn't say he throw, because you can hear there's something sort of wrong with it. Oftentimes in English, we put an S on the end of verbs that are matched with a singular subject. He throws. Note, we also have verbs that match plural subject. In the sentence, they threw, our subject is plural, they. There's more than one person in that subject. So we would say they threw. In this verb, now we wouldn't say, again, they throw. Well, we could say they throw in present tense, but for example, we wouldn't say they throws. Again, you can hear there's something sort of wrong with that combination, because throws belongs with a singular subject, whereas threw belongs with a plural subject. So our goal is not to learn all the rules about how English verbs are associated with singular or plural subject nouns, but these examples just show you that Hebrew verbs do the same types of things. They change their spelling to match either a singular or a plural subject. So person, gender, and number all work closely together. They're all telling us something about the subject of the verb, and so the verb is going to match up with that subject. It's going to have a first, second person, or third person subject. It's going to have a subject that's either going to be masculine, feminine, or it might be a mix of the two. We call that common in Hebrew. And the number, it's either going to be, there's either going to be one subject or there's going to be a group of something, reflected in our subject. How all of these 5 elements come together are in a system of endings that we add to verb roots. Now, every Hebrew verb actually consists of 3 letters. Now, some of these details are going to be, extra information than what you need to master for this course. But I'm going to take you through this slide just so you can see how Hebrew verbs look and sort of how they work and how all of those 5 components, stem, tense, person, gender, and number, work together in a verb. And they all work together in the way the verb is spelled. We've sort of already led up to that a little bit. But note that we've talked about perfect verbs. The perfect tense or conjugation. Essentially, that's a verb that's past tense. It's the action has been completed. Its completed action has already been completed, so we render it in the past tense. So the perfect here reflects essentially one of our 5 tenses or conjugations that we talked about. And we also talked about 7 stems, one of them being cal. And so the example here that we have a chart is what cal perfect verbs look like. So we're combining one of our 7 stems, cal, with one of our 5 tenses, perfect. So you can see how those verbs look. Now we could also have PL perfect verbs or PUL perfect verbs. I could also give you a cal imperfect verb where I could change the tense up on you, or a cal participle. So there's all kinds of combinations possible in Hebrew. It's beyond the scope of our course to see how they all work together. This is just one example. So perfect verbs in Hebrew, they're very common, and they essentially have a special system of endings that are added to the end of them. You can see them in red here on this chart. Now on this chart, those endings reflect all of those 5 elements that we've talked about in parsing. These endings are specifically assigned for perfect verbs in Hebrew. There are some other things going on in each of these examples here. There's actually a certain spelling in each of these verbs that associates it with the cal stem. And I'll tell you what it is, and this, again, it's not something that you need to memorize, but there's a comets vowel below the first consonant in all these verbs. That comets vowel is actually a hint. It's telling you that these verbs are cal verbs. That's the stem. Remember our stem, what that means for cal verbs. It means these verbs are simple action and active voice. And we get all that information essentially through that little pattern vowel that we see. And then these endings, again, these endings reflect, not only are those specific endings, they only occur on perfect verbs. So those endings are telling us a lot of information too. They're telling us that these verbs are perfect, meaning the action's already happened. The action's completed, so that means we translate all of these in the past tense. And these endings also tell us other information. For example, the comets hey on the end of a verb is telling us that the subject is third feminine singular. Now, it's actually got a subject built into the verb too, so comets hey actually tells us that we supply the subject, which is she. So, and the verb katal, I should mention, go back to the first block here. Kof tet lamed is a 3-letter verb, and it means to kill, essentially. And just so you know, katal, it's a typical verb that's used in these types of charts because it's a regular verb. We have other verbs that are irregular. Many verbs in Hebrew are irregular, meaning the letters change on us and all kinds of stuff. So katal is used in most example charts like this so you can see what verbs look like and how they work with these endings. So katal means to kill, and when it has a special ending, it essentially tells us what the subject is of the verb. If you'll note in the first block here, though, this is our third masculine singular form of the verb. And note that it doesn't have any ending on the end there. So the third masculine singular form of cal perfect verbs is actually denoted by the absence of an ending. That's sort of a lot like masculine singular nouns, if you remember back. Masculine singular nouns, we also denoted them because they didn't have a special ending. Well, it's kind of the same in masculine singular verbs. There's no special ending there. Now, the third person masculine singular subject is actually he. There's a pronoun that fits with that third masculine singular sort of placeholder there. It's actually telling us that there's a pronoun subject that we plug into the verb. So we would plug in the pronoun he killed. Again, past tense because we have perfect verbs, and perfect verbs tell us the action's completed, and we translate them past tense. And then you can see in every other form there's an ending in red. And that ending all is telling us this information. It's telling us the person, gender, and number. So that's what each of these sort of three little letters and numbers together are telling us. It's telling us those three things: person, gender, and number. So 3 stands for third person, M stands for masculine, and S stands for singular. And 3 and the next one stands for, again, third person. Third person, again, is he, she, it, or they. It stands for feminine, so that narrows it. And it stands for singular as well. So there's only one pronoun that fits that bill, and it's she. It's third person, feminine, and singular. Now, third person singular is denoted by this ending. It's a kametz he. And the kametz he tells us that our subject of the verb is this word she killed. Then we have our second person forms following each other. Second person, so 2 stands for second person, M stands for masculine, and S stands for singular. So second person, masculine, singular. A second person masculine singular is just, it means I'm talking to one person. The subject is you, and it means that subject is also masculine. So you killed means that we're speaking to a masculine subject. There's only one subject there, you killed. And that's denoted by this special ending, a tav, with a kametz vowel below it. Then we move to the second person feminine singular verb form, and note it has a different ending. It's got a tav with a silent shabbat, and we translate that as you killed. And lastly, we get to our first person forms. Now, usually we're used to seeing verb charts like this begin with the first person. But in Hebrew, it sort of comes last, and there are sort of reasons for that. It's because the third masculine singular form here has no ending, and so because of that, this is the form that you actually would find in a lexicon. So what you find in a lexicon in Hebrew, the basic form of the verb is considered the third person masculine singular cal perfect verb. So that's considered the most basic type of verb for any verb we could have in Hebrew. That's why we begin our charts with the third person in Hebrew verbs. But to pick back up in the first person form, the last one on the left column is, again, 1CS stands for first person. C here stands for common. There is no gender associated in first person. So it could be either masculine or feminine in this case. And S stands for singular. Now that little combo there essentially means our subject is simply I. So first person common singular means the subject of the verb is I. And again, if in this phrase I killed, we don't know, who the subject is, whether it's masculine or feminine. It could be either. And there's a special ending for that one. It's actually a tav, hirik, yod. All that together tells us we have a first person common singular verb. And we plug in the subject I. Note how the verbs are all basically the same. They're all past tense. It's just the subjects are changing. And the subjects change based on the ending that they either don't have with third masculine singular or these other endings. Comets he means the subject is she. Tav comets means the subject is you, and so forth. Look at the plural forms, and then we'll sort of give an overview over what we intend to do with this chart. The plural verb forms, there's some, that means that the subject is plural. So the left-hand column, these are all our singular subjects, and this right-hand column we turn to our plural verb subjects. The first one is a third common plural, and all that means, again, third common plural is common just means our subject can be either masculine or feminine, or it can be mixed. It could be a group of mixed, men and women together, essentially, in a crowd. That's sort of something to think about when you think about the common in Hebrew. What we get in third common plural verbs is they end in a shorik. That's their form. Katalu, they end in an oo sound with this u vowel. And the third common plural verbs subject is always going to be this word they killed. Again, kill is just reflects our verb root, katal, kof, tet, lamed. And the shurik here tells us it's the third common plural, and we plug in this word subject they. Then we have the second person, the plural forms. They still are translated as you, just like singular, because in English, you, our subject you, can either be singular or plural. In the right-hand column, the plural side, we could make it y'all if we wanted to, or you all. That helps to make it plural for us to hear it in English. So Hebrew actually distinguishes it. They do change the spelling for their second person forms, so it's very precise. Note the second person masculine plural subject that has a special ending. It's a tav with a sigol following it and a mem following it. So it's tem is the ending. And that ending, the subject is just you, again, or you all killed. Our second person feminine plural form, it looks a lot like the last one, the second person masculine plural, but it's got a tav sigol noon instead. And again, our subject is still you. And lastly, we have our first person plural subject. Again, it's first person common plural. The common, the C there, just means it's masculine or feminine. It's plural, and our subject is we. In this case, we killed. And the ending there is noon with a shurik. Now, you do not need to memorize these endings at all. I'll do a couple of example sentences for you to show you what they look like, but your homework isn't even going to dip into these endings. Your homework is only going to use the third masculine singular verb here in some sentences for you to get accustomed to. I only mention this chart and go through it carefully so that you can see that Hebrew verbs are inflected or spelled differently depending on whether their subject is third person or singular or plural. As you can see, the spelling or the ending that's added to it, it changes depending on what the subject is. So if we were going to take a whole class of Hebrew, we'd memorize this chart and we would learn all of these endings well and learn, off the top of our heads that comets he is third feminine singular. That means we supply the pronoun she to the verb. In this class, we don't need to memorize all these, but you do need to be aware that, at least roughly, this is how Hebrew verbs are working. This also just shows you again that every Hebrew verb conveys 5 things, and it does that by the system of endings. It conveys tense, stem, person, gender, and number. And again, those endings we just talked about convey all of these things. Except for perhaps stem is the only thing not conveyed by those endings. Stem is conveyed more by the internal spelling of the verb, which we talked about. This little comets vowel is actually a clue for this is a cal verb. Again, you don't need to memorize that, but just so you can see how the exact way these verbs are spelled is telling you all of those 5 things. That one, the stem is cal. These endings are specifically telling you they're only ever used for perfect verbs. And as you can see, each ending also conveys something very specific about the subject, meaning the person, the gender, and the number. All right, so if we were to parse verbs, this is essentially what that would look like. And again, we're not really going to parse verbs in this class just because Hebrew, you have a lot going on with the vowels, learning the consonants of the alphabet and the vowels. So we're not going to parse, we're not going to add that to the mix at this stage. But again, you do want to be aware of the 5 parts or component parts of parsing that are involved in every Hebrew verb. But if we were going to parse some verbs, this is what it would look like. So again, every Hebrew verb actually only has 3 letters, and to those 3 letters is added some of these endings that we talked about. So in the verb mem, lamed, kaf, that verb actually means to rule. And if we added one of those endings to it, one of these, endings that we've learned, we can begin to parse it. And so if we added the tav with the comets below it to that 3-letter root, note we get something very specific with that tav comets. That tav comets tells us, A, it's a perfect verb, and it also tells us it's a second person masculine singular, which means we supply the subject you to the verb. So note here our 3-letter root, malak means to rule, malakta, we parse that as a second masculine singular. It's a cal verb. You'll just have to sort of take my word on that at this point. And it's perfect because of that ending, and that's how we parse it. And we translate it as you ruled. It's past tense because it's perfect, and it's 2ms, it's second masculine singular subject because of this specific ending in red that you can see. Another verb we could talk about is shafat. Shin, pei, tet. Together, those 3 letters mean to judge. Shafat. Now we can add one of those endings to shafat and get something differently. If we added the ending noon shurik to shafat, we get shafat nu. And if I go back to my chart, you see the noon shurik ending under the first common plural categorization here, meaning we supply the subject we to that. Again, it's perfect, which means it's past tense. So what we get with that is we get, it's translated as we judged, past tense. Again, this little ending here, the noon shurik, tells us it's a first common plural cal perfect verb. One more example, just so you can get the hang of it. We have another verb, noon, beit, aleph, that means to prophesy. Those 3 letters together mean to prophesy. Note, I'm not giving you the vowels underneath it because it's actually the 3 consonants that convey the meaning of the verb. The vowels just help us know how to pronounce it. We could add a shurik to the end of that, nava, and get navu, a shurik there on the end. The shurik, if we went back to our chart, we would see the shurik is our 3rd common plural form, meaning we would have to insert the subject they in that particular translation. So navu, we know our subject is they, and we just turn the translation past tense, they prophesied. So that shurik just tells us it's a 3rd common plural cal perfect verb. Again, don't worry if you're not catching all these details. This is really just an overview to somehow get you inside Hebrew verbs a little bit. As mentioned, you have your plate full with mastering the alphabet and the vowels at this stage. We're only throwing in verbs a bit so you can learn how to essentially define terms that you can understand what the stems mean, what cal means, what pl means, and so that you can understand what the tenses or conjugations mean. You want to know what perfect means or what imperfect means. So know those types of things, but you won't be asked to parse a verb on an exam or anything like that. What we will practice more with in Hebrew are translating a sentence. So translating sentences can help you to see the flow of how Hebrew works. And again, it's just helping acclimate you a bit more to the language. Again, you don't need to learn all the ins and outs of translating Hebrew sentences. This is just to show you the basics of how Hebrew works so that you're a little more familiar with Hebrew as you go to do the word studies. When we talk about sentences in word order, we're essentially talking about what we call syntax, how a sentence hangs together and conveys meaning. Hebrew has a very regular word order. Unlike Greek, can have a varied word order, and the case endings for nouns help piece of a Greek sentence together. Hebrew is different. Hebrew does rely more on word order like English does. The difference is that Hebrew, it reorders the sentence order than what we're used to in English. In English, we're used to the subject coming first, God, followed by the verb created, followed by an object. The heavens and the earth are the two objects. Hebrew, essentially, what it does is it flip-flops that order, and it takes a verb and it essentially puts the verb before its subject. So it's a little bit odd. It's essentially like saying created God the heavens and the earth. But how we render that in English is God created the heavens and the earth. So take this, for example, you can see here where a verb comes first, followed by its subject, followed by the object. So in this sentence, this comes straight out of Genesis 1:1. Bara is a verb. Note it's got those three letters, Beit, Resh, Aleph. And bara, if we looked that up in a lexicon, we would see it's actually the third masculine singular form. Note it doesn't have an ending. So verbs that don't have an ending that we've talked about, those are third masculine singular, meaning they're going to match. We need a singular subject that's masculine following it. But bara means to create, or literally it means he created. But what we do is, because the subject follows it, we essentially plug in, Elohim as the subject of that verb. So what we get is Elohim, or God created, bara. So this is just a great example so you can see in Hebrew the verb actually comes first. So they're called verb first sentences. The verb comes first. This is a very typical thing in Semitic languages. The verb comes first, followed by its subject, followed by the objects of the verb. Now in Hebrew, we do have this neat little thing. It's called a mark of the definite direct object. It's spelled with an aleph, sigol, tav. Sometimes it might be spelled with a tsere, just two little dots below it. But that little marker, you can see there's two of them here. That marker tells us, we don't translate it, it's just telling us what follows it is the object of the verb, direct object of the verb. So God created what? This is telling us what comes next is the object. God created the heavens, and we have a conjunction stuck in there before one of those markers, and the earth. So this is just a basic sentence order so that you can see how Hebrew works in a general way. Hebrew does not always follow this sentence order, but this is a typical word order that it does follow. Verb first, bara, followed by its subject, Elohim. So meaning we always have to plug the subject in to the verb, God created. Et, we don't translate. Hashemayim, the heavens. Va'et, ha'aretz, the earth. We'll take a look at some example sentences so you can get the hang of this, because this is something that you will do in your exercises this week. In this sentence, we have Natan Adonai. This is the divine name of the Lord. It's tradition to pronounce that the name is Adonai. We translate it as Lord into English. Et haaretz. In this case, I've given you the translations for each of these words below it. Natan, that's a verb. It means gave, to give. All the verbs we're dealing with in this course are perfect, meaning they're past tense. We're going to translate them as past tense. And again, all the verbs you see in your homework, they're also all going to be third masculine singular cal-perfect verbs, meaning that you won't see an ending on them. So just like you don't see an ending added to the end of natan, that means it's singular, it's third person, singular masculine. Meaning you'll be looking to see what comes next, what comes after the verb, because that's going to be its subject. So we have natan, which is gave, Adonai, and Adonai, or the Lord, that becomes the subject of the verb. So we have the Lord gave. Note we have this little mark of the definite direct object. That's a mouthful there. Et, we don't translate it. It's just telling us what follows is the direct object of the verb. So the Lord, Natan, gave haaretz, the land. Note you can see that prefix definite article that we talked about, the hey with the comments before the noun aretz there. So the Lord gave the land. Next we have only two words, Shema HaMelech. Shema means to hear, or in our past tense, heard. It's third masculine singular, meaning we need a subject that's masculine and singular to go before it. Note that its subject follows the verb. The subject is the king, HaMelech. Again, note the subject is definite. It's got a definite article before it. So what we get is the king heard. So the king becomes the subject of the verb, and it follows its verb. The king heard. Our next example, again, our sentence begins with a verb. I might mention briefly, you might see the two dots at the end of the verse there, or the sentence. Those two dots operate like a period does in English. They end the verse or the sentence for us. But this particular sentence begins with malach, that means to reign or to rule, becomes past tense because these are all perfect verbs, to ruled. Our subject is going to follow. In this case we have king. Actually, it should just be king without a definite article there. So a king ruled. Note again we have the mark of the definite direct object that follows. It's not translated, it's just telling us that what follows is the direct object of the verb. So a king ruled haaretz, the land. Again, you see that prefixed definite article before that noun there, haaretz. A king ruled the land or the earth. Either one is fine. Now here's an example of a verb that does have an ending, and I've thrown it in just so you can see how it works, although your homework or the final exam will not have this on it. I have this verb shamarnu. Now this is actually translated, this particular ending, that's our first common plural ending for perfect verbs, which means we have to supply the subject we before it. Now in that case, we becomes the subject. It's specified in the ending. We kept, and in that case we just translate it. There is no special subject that follows the verb in there in that case. So we kept, note the mark of the definite direct object. What did we keep? Ha-torot, the laws, becomes the object of the verb there. Ha-torot. Note the definite article prefixed there. And then here's another example. Third person verbs all do have a subject, can have a subject, I should say, that follows it. Here's another one so you can see sort of a different type of verb with an ending. This is the shorek on the end of this one. Nafal means to fall. And with the shorek on the end, it means we have a third common plural 3CP subject, meaning it's third person, it's plural, can be either masculine or feminine. Note how this verb is followed by the noun ha-anashim. Anashim is the word for men. Note that it's plural. That actually becomes the subject of our verb. So the men fell becomes our sentence. Now, again, these last couple of examples you won't see in your homework, but you will typically find in your homework, and you'll have a couple of phrases to translate on the final. They'll just be the third masculine singular verbs, and you will look directly following them to find their subject. So always look to the second word of the sentence essentially, and that's where you find the subject of the sentence. So a king ruled the land. That exercise will give you just some practice with Hebrew syntax, just so you can get used to it. Anytime you translate Hebrew in this course, I'll give you the vocab list, so you don't need to memorize vocabulary. Just use it as an exercise to get acclimated to Hebrew a bit more. That's our basic goal at this stage. Your main task in Hebrew is actually going to be continuing to master the alphabet and the vowels. Those are really the most important thing that we're going to get from Hebrew, simply because knowing that information is crucial to being able to look up a word in a lexicon. So that's our big task, and with Hebrew, that just takes some time to sink in, as you probably have learned at this point. It's a little more complex than other languages, just because it's a right to left language. We read it from right to left, and so there's some different things going on in Hebrew. It's also got vowels that are these markings below the letter and next to it. So all of those foreign aspects are enough to sort of get a hold of to be able to do a word study in Hebrew. The rest of the grammar, we're just sort of barely dipping into it, so you can kind of get some familiarity with Hebrew. But I want to point you to just the couple more examples here of verb stems in Hebrew, because the verb stems and verbs, as with any language, can help us get inside the language a little bit more. These three examples, I haven't pointed out the Hebrew term behind the English, but I have just shown you some English translations of verbs, and I've also put the stem next to the verb so that you can sort of see how learning some of these details of the stems and such actually help us get a little bit of insight into verbs in Hebrew. So let's look at the first example here. All these come from Genesis. In Genesis 2:16 to 17, we have the story of Eden, God's creation of the first human couple, and we have the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "From any tree of the garden you may eat, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die." In this particular verse, we actually have a word. It's in Hebrew. It's deber. Deber is its Hebrew pronunciation. We translate deber as command in English, and deber is actually a PL verb. PL verb. Now, remember back, it's a PL stem, I should say. So if you went back to our chart of stems that we learned earlier on, you can sort of start to see some nuances of the verb emerging. So remember, we learned PL stems, how sometimes, PL verbs, they are always active voice, but they can be intensive action, meaning there's just an intensified action in play. And in this example in Genesis 3, we do see that intensified action a bit. We see the Lord commanding, uttering a command essentially. And so, of course, the narrative, you can see the narrative playing together, holding together in what it's directing, and essentially we know where the narrative ends. But this particular verse shows us that there is sort of a direct command that's issued, and we're waiting to see what happens with that command, whether it's heeded or not. But this just shows you how this particular verb, deber, is translated as command. It's in the PL stem. And the PL, again, the PL can convey an intensive action. And certainly we can see that intensified type of action coming through in the verb commanded. Then note Genesis 2:21. Here's a great example of a causative verb stem, hiphil. Remember, we talked about hiphil. Hiphil is sort of one of the more difficult ones to understand in Hebrew. Hiphil, there's a causative type of thing. Someone caused something to happen. That's essentially what hiphil means. Note we see that in Genesis 2:21. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on the man, and he slept. Here, this whole phrase, it's one verb, nafal, and it's the translation. It note in English, it had to be split up just to be made sense in Hebrew. So the Lord God caused something. He caused to fall. He caused to fall a deep sleep upon the man. So the Lord is the causative force behind this deep sleep falling on the man. And that's a perfect sentence, so you can see the causative, the hiphil stem at work there. And then in Genesis 6:6 gives us a bit of insight into the hitpael stem. We learned earlier that the hitpael stem, it's an active stem, it's active voice, and it often conveys a reflexive action, meaning the subject is performing an action, the action is kind of coming back around to the subject. We sort of see that reflexive voice a bit in Genesis 6:6, which says this is sort of the precursor to the flood narrative and Noah and so forth. And this particular verse says, "And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." In this sense, you can really see this sort of grief process sort of coming back around. In fact, we could see, the subject really is he grieved him. It is grieving him to his heart. You almost see this sort of reflexive type of action going on there, just deep grief sort of cycling around here. So this is one example of how we see the hitpael stem at work in the text. And it's sometimes the nuances are a little difficult. It's difficult to see an exact sort of reflexive thing going on where the subject is performing something on itself. Sometimes you almost see sort of a repetitive type of action going on with a hitpael. And this is sort of, it's a little difficult to sort of tease that out in this case, but that just kind of goes to show you that sometimes understanding the precise sense of some of these stems, it's takes some reflection to consider what type of action is really going on here and how the stem is informing that. But nonetheless, these three stems here at play show you how the stems are fairly colorful when we unpack them in a Hebrew verb. And again, if you looked up any of these verbs in a lexicon or a dictionary, you'd likely be able to find more information on the stems and what they mean for these verbs. Alright, so this is an overview of Hebrew verbs and syntax. Again, your main clue or your main task this week is to treat it like an exercise in vocabulary. You want to learn those what the 5 parts of parsing are: tense, stem, person, gender, and number. You want to know the 5 tenses or conjugations in Hebrew, and you also want to be familiar with the 7 stems in Hebrew. And then your next sort of task is to get a little more familiar with translating some basic sentences in Hebrew, and you'll get that practice with your homework.